So my honor, my privilege to be here with you this morning. I told my friend and colleague, Dr. Langley, I wish I had gone before her. She's a tough act to follow, but I will do my best. I'm excited that we are here because we have folks who are in the room who typically do not speak and talk and work with one another. So this is encouraging, this is exciting, this gives us a new opportunity to do something different. So what I'm going to share with you today, I'm sure much of you already know, but I think it bears some repeating because we have to get this right. We have to get this right. We must get this right. Children are depending, needing us to get this right on their behalf. I come to you as someone who's been at UCLA for almost 20 years now, but that's not the real part of my story I need you to understand. I need you to understand the part of my story that says I grew up in Compton, California. And there's a narrative about growing up in Compton that says that folks who look like me should not be here. But I know I'm not the only one who has a similar kind of story. I know I have some South LA folks in here today, right? I see you. I have some East LA folks in here today. I have some folks who grew up in Watts. And part of what I say is that we have to get this right because as much as there is a narrative around certain zip codes and certain communities and certain populations, I think we have to begin to rethink and reframe the ways in which we think about, talk about, and respond to trauma. Now, obviously, today is around looking at and understanding some of the factors that happen outside of schools that contribute to trauma. And that is important. We must focus on those areas. We must talk about those areas. However, what I want to talk about is how schools have to be better to not contribute to the trauma that happens outside of schools. That makes sense to folks? Because oftentimes we talk about these traumas as if they exclusively occur outside of schools. And for someone who's a former classroom teacher, I have witnessed enough trauma happening in schools and in classrooms sometimes that make matters for our students worse. So part of what I want to make sure is that we frame this conversation in a way that's more comprehensive, that's more inclusive, that also takes into account school-based trauma. Does that make sense to folks? So let's get into it. I think we have to be mindful of the fact that as we talk about this, we have to ask a simple question. Who are the students that we are serving every single day? And part of why this is important is because we oftentimes operate from a one-size-fits-all approach as if all students are the same, as if they think the same, talk the same, act the same, and therefore we come up with interventions that are pretty much, very much universal. And when they don't work, we begin to blame the students and not begin to look at the context from which our students come from. So I say we have to be mindful of racial, ethnic, cultural, linguistic makeup of the students that we serve. And part of what we have not done across the board here in Los Angeles County is serve certain students well, i.e. enhancing the sense of school-based trauma. So I maintain that if we're going to have this work right, we have to ask why is culturally responsive approach to schooling necessary? It's necessary because, again, culture is something I think we oftentimes have a very warped perception of. We have oftentimes a very undeveloped sort of construction of. And I think if we're going to create trauma-informed, culturally responsive schools, we must understand what trauma is and how trauma works, but also understand what culture is and how culture works. I maintain one of the biggest challenges that we have is a disconnect between who teaches and who learns. I'll say it again. Big disconnect between who teaches and who learns. And I think you can have very well-intentioned educators who are just culturally disconnected, culturally informed about the students that they serve, and therefore many labels get placed, I believe, unfairly, unjustly on lots of students of color, only reinforcing the trauma, or in some cases, causing trauma in the first place, okay? So if we're going to have culturally responsive schools, we have to start with some data here, okay? So here we are, state of California. You all have seen these data before. I think it's important to have some hard conversations to look at who is graduating and who is not. If you look at data from the Department of Education, 15-16, by race, ethnicity, and gender, it points to a disturbing challenge. Part of that challenge is the fact that if you look at these data across the board, girls outperform boys on every measure when it comes to graduating from high school. To that I say, go girls, right? But at the same time, I would like to see both groups be at 100%. And what we cannot ignore is the fact that there are some obvious racial discrepancies here. Namely, if you look at the fact that African-American students lag behind everyone else, Native American students are right there. The fact that we have only 67% of our black males graduate from high school, that should give us all concern and outrage. The fact that only about 70% of Native American boys graduate, that should give us some concern. The fact that Latino students, we see that Latino males are only at 76%. So we have to ask some questions, not about what's wrong with the students, but what is wrong with the system that is serving these students that contributes to these discrepancies. These discrepancies are not new. We have seen these for some time, but part of what we have to remember is, what do the old folks tell us? That the surest sign of insanity is doing what? Same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So part of what we have to do, if we understand these data, is ask ourselves the question, why are we doing the same things, getting same results, but then we ask ourselves, what's wrong with the students? I ask us to think about what's wrong with the systems and the services that are offered to children in the first place, and how can they be more racially and culturally specific. That makes sense to folks?